Methods 5 and method 6 are somewhat more costly, and you'll see that they're not as readily used as the middle two permanent solutions. So method 5 is the rubber and sidewalk panels, and that's a very new method, new to the market. Very few cities are using that method, but what that is a composite material, and it basically replaces the asphalt. So what a city crew member can do, they'll go out, they'll take up the sidewalk, they'll trim the roots, they'll do what they need to do to level out the sidewalk, and they'll put these plastic panels down. So if there ever is another problem, they're not going to have to replace the concrete again. All they do is come out, lift the panel, take care of the root system, and drop it back down, and everything is leveled. And finally, the metal root bridges, as you can see here, is just a metal plate that will actually go over the root, and the root will just grow underneath that plate, and the sidewalk will remain level. Next slide, please. So, using cost information that we gathered from the city and coupling it with the table 2 slides back, we were able to come up with this chart. And what this chart shows is the cost of a certain method and the percentage of cities that are using the method. And what we found interesting in this chart was these middle two permanent solutions were the most widely used. As you can see, they're used by 100% of the cities. These two, you can see, are not as readily used because they are not permanent solutions. And the last two, very expensive solutions, and one is actually new to the market. Next slide, please. So, from our data set, we decided to use the chi-square test of independence. And chi-squares are used quantitatively to measure, to determine whether there's a relationship that exists between two variables. They're also used to compare one group to a hypothetical value. In our case, we wanted to see if, actually let me preface this with, we actually came up with a new statistical hypothesis after analyzing our data, and that hypothesis was the cost and the method of repair are not related factors when it comes to deciding upon a method for sidewalk repair. After we went through our chi-square calculations, we actually found that to be not true, and according to the chi-square statistical analysis, there is a relationship between the cost and the method of repair. And finally, statistical analysis methods are very highly data-driven, and what we found after examining our data set, we found that the chi-square analysis was the best fit for us. Next slide, please. So from the beginning of our research, we set out to answer 3 questions. And in answering those questions, we observed that from the questionnaires, there are new methods and materials out there that are being used in other cities that are not being used in San Diego. We also observed that out of the cities that responded to us, there were a very small amount of cities that actually had written policies and procedures in place when they go out to evaluate the sidewalk problems, and there's very little documentation on the methods of repair of those sidewalks. And lastly, we observed that 9 out of 11 cities had written policies in place regarding tree preservation of the urban forest. And it's good to know that San Diego is actually included in that list. So that concludes my section of this presentation. I'd like to pass it on to Mary, and she'll wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Chapter 5 on the next slide involves our conclusions. So we found that in our review of literature, there were some new materials and methods that San Diego could use, and our benchmarking study turned that up as well. For example, in the review of literature, we read about a study where they used 18-inch tall root barriers rather than 12 in some situations, and those situations were when brand new trees were being planted to replace old trees that have either died or fallen over, or just brand new trees that were planted where there were not trees planted before. The reason it's not a suitable application for existing trees is that trees have a surface root structure and they have deep roots. And if you start cutting deeper than 12 inches, you risk cutting the deep roots and then affecting the stability of the tree. So the 18-inch root barriers are really only advised when new trees are being planted. But that is something that San Diego could consider that they're not presently doing, and that minimizes the amount of future damage to the sidewalk. Another thing we found in the review of literature was the rubber and plastic sidewalk panels, and we also found that in our benchmarking study being used by other cities. And as Chris mentioned, there are advantages to that when you have to go back and do maintenance later on the tree roots, lifting up the panels and easily replacing them without the cost and time involved in demolishing concrete and replacing that. But in addition, there are some locations where the tree roots on the surface are pretty significant. And if you try to excavate at all, you're going to compromise the structure of the tree and kill it or cause it to fall over, which is, again, is a risk to the city. Risk management needs to be considered with any engineering problem. And these panels are only 2 inches thick, the rubber and plastic sidewalk panels, where the typical section of a concrete sidewalk is 4 inches thick. So again, by using these panels, you don't have to excavate as deeply to replace the walking surface. So this minimizes the impact to the tree. And finally, we found that some other agencies do utilize written procedures, which San Diego does not. So we thought that would be a beneficial suggestion for them to come up with written policies and procedures that the engineering staff can use when evaluating what conditions exist and what your options are to do a repair. Next slide, please. So these are our recommendations that management must implement and support and fund continuing research and benchmarking. The engineering staff could be doing what we have done during the course of our study, which is to stay abreast of new materials and new engineering methods, and to benchmark, to be in touch with other agencies to learn what they're doing. This would assist them in building the knowledge base and increasing the expertise of their engineering staff. Also, management should support and fund implementation and monitoring of some pilot programs so they can install some of these rubber and plastic sidewalks around town and monitor them and determine their efficiency for continued use. Also, management needs to adopt and insist upon the use of written standard operating procedures by the engineering staff. This would help them to have consistency in their design. Also, as employee turnover happens, it would lessen the learning curve for new employees because there's something in writing to help to train them and get some consistency in that way among the engineering staff. And finally, staff training should be continuous, so that will also contribute to better management of the backlog and better engineering practices being utilized. Next slide, please. So what we came up with to help them is this decision tree that outlines the process that they would go through from the time they look at a damaged sidewalk and start looking at all the conditions and situations they encounter to help them choose a design for repair. We also wrote a standard operating procedure to be used hand in hand with this decision tree, and that should help staff to make their engineering design decisions as well. Next slide, please. And we feel that our study uncovered some results that support our hypothesis, and we hope that our recommendations will help the City of San Diego Street Division to improve their engineering practices and thus their management of the concrete backlog and preserve trees along the way as well. And we thank you for your attention, and we'll be glad to handle any questions you have at this time.
You compared a number of these cities in that regard, right? And the methods of comparison in terms of what the methods they used for a given problem
was actually from the respondents themselves. So we didn't actually present them with any type of methods for them to ponder. We basically sent out questions that led them along to these particular answers. So all these methods were actually instigated by the actual agencies themselves, and I just translated those into a table.
So these methods were in your part of your survey.
They volunteered this information.
It was an open-ended question.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
They volunteered the information, and the answers were consistent enough to actually formulate this table.
It's my understanding that you did the chi-square to equate there is a relationship between in this case, the method used versus the
cost.
The cost.
With that hypothesis. That's why I mentioned that we added a statistical hypothesis to our paper.
We had
we had no idea that that was going to happen. So basically, after we assessed all of our data, we realized, hey, we can go ahead and create a new hypothesis, and we can do a chi-square analysis or excessive independence on the data. So as soon as
the roots, how big is this tree? How old is this tree? What species is this tree? So you evaluate the tree, and the question is, does the root zone need to be maximized? And it does if you're too close to it. You need to maximize the root zone. So there are some different ways you can do that. If not, if it doesn't need to be maximized, then you can do the typical thing, which is prune the roots, install a root barrier, remove and replace the sidewalk, and you're finished. But if you have to give more room to the tree so you don't hurt it, then ask, can you increase the root zone? Because sometimes you can't. If you can't, then the question is, can you remove the tree? That's not the best option, but sometimes it's done. If you can't remove the tree because it's a protected species or it's a significant tree, such as a historical tree that's protected because of its age and size, then you have to utilize alternative materials to avoid cutting the roots and preserve the tree, such as exactly what we're talking about. And when they would get to this point, the staff would just say, we don't know what to do, we have no alternatives, so we're just going to leave it on the backlog. And those were some of those locations from 2002 that they had no engineering solution for, so they didn't fix it. And the city remained liable, the risk was still there. Okay, but on this side, other ways to increase the root zone are to meander the sidewalk, which is to change the configuration of the sidewalk. If there's room in the right-of-way, you can pick the whole sidewalk up and move it away from the tree up against the property line. Or you can narrow the sidewalk as long as you maintain the 39-inch requirement by the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, to allow wheelchair access. You can narrow the sidewalk. Or you can do both. You can narrow it and pick it up and move it over up against the property line to maximize the root zone in that way. And then going on through here, there are just some other options. If you can remove the tree, you remove the tree, then you replace the sidewalk, plant a new tree, and maybe the 18-inch root barrier we were talking about. This is the appropriate decision in this case. It's the appropriate design. And going on through. Another special case is, are there large roots that cause a steep transition? And if that's the case, you might want to use the plastic or rubber sidewalk panels or structural soil, which we also read about in our review of literature. The structural soil under the sidewalk has the effect of causing the roots to grow smaller and disperse more widely so that they displace the sidewalk less and cause less pain. Some of it, again, is a little bit subjective. The engineering staff tries to look at each location and decide what design of repair they can implement that will minimize the risk of the tree falling over. But if you get 5 arborists to look at a tree and sidewalk damage, you may get different opinions about the exact percentage of risk involved. You know, 3 of them might say, that tree's going to fall over. And 2 others might say, well, I think it's going to fall over, but I can't really say when, and it may be okay for a while. So some of these things are a little more subjective. A lot of their repair is sort of reactive rather than proactive. So they're just being told, fix this, remove the risk to the city. Sometimes we don't even care how much it costs, just fix it. And other times, in years when the budget is very restricted, the backlog continues to grow and they can't do anything about it anyway because the funding doesn't allow them to.
It's about the same answer that I would come up, that I would have. To add to that, each situation is somewhat independent of previous situation. That's actually one of the reasons behind, what we are doing now, is so that if there is ever a situation that's very similar, it could be quickly resolved. You wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel in a sense for every situation.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think both teams deserve a round of applause for the great job that they did. And I think, as you can see online, there's a round of applause going on up there. That's kind of cute.